I want to begin by stating a God principle which it would behoove all Christians and Jews to embrace. We can only ascertain God's identity in the same way Daniel's outlined for us, by means of God's name and his inherent attributes. That's how we know God. And it might seem within Judeo-Christianity that discerning God's identity is a long-settled matter. And so to re-examine it has little bearing on modern Christianity or Judaism. But in fact, God's identity, and thus especially as believers who we identify with, has become muddled. God's identity has become muddled and compromised, even though most Christians and many Jews who occupy our synagogues and churches are unaware of it. Because of the resurgence of Islamic influence, especially in the Western world, there's this concerted effort, mostly by well-meaning Christians, to find a pathway to a middle ground in order to achieve peace with the Muslim world. One of the new focuses of Christian missionary work is now aimed, rightly so, at the more than 1 billion Muslims on our planet. And due to much failure to make very many converts, a new approach is underway that seems to be achieving better results. And that approach is to explain to Muslims that their God and the God of the Christians is the same God. And further, that their holy book, the Quran, is just as valid and just as worthy as is the Hebrew scriptures and is the Christian Bible. Thus, Christians ought to feel free to learn the customs and the prayers of Muslims, join them in their mosques as they worship Allah all together, one voice, and that Muslims ought to reciprocate by joining Christians in churches and praying with believers. The so-called emergent church is quite open to this concept. Even a new term called Chrislam has been coined to identify this movement within Christianity. Now, I personally encountered this phenomenon well over a decade ago as I was working in an executive capacity at an evangelical megachurch. The pastor dropped a booklet on my desk. He asked me to review it and then tell him how many we needed to order. It had been produced by the missions board of this well-respected evangelical denomination, and because the annual missions week focus was only a few weeks off, hundreds of thousands of this booklet had been printed in order to hand out to the many congregations that formed this denomination. And the booklet essentially explained to the denominational membership that for the sake of spreading the gospel of Christ, we ought to accept that Allah is the same as Jehovah and the same as the God of Israel. And that there's nothing wrong with the Quran as a holy book. And that we ought to seek out Muslims to pray with and to pray with them in the name of Allah. In fact, Muslims have always been praying to Jesus, they just didn't know it. After I climbed down off the ceiling and I gathered myself, I went into the pastor, I showed him some underlying passages, and he went red in the face. And much to his credit, he immediately put in a call to the missions board, logged his protest, and told them this booklet was unwelcome in his church. Now, I have close contact with one of the largest non-denominational Christian missions group in the Middle East. And many of their missionaries hold that same viewpoint about Allah and Islam that I just explained to you. And even those missionaries who have some misgivings, some reservations about it, still adhere to it in practice because of the good results they seem to be getting in getting Muslims to accept Jesus. But all is not as it seems.